not yet. In 1923, 80 years after the events of Willowbrook, Beaufort County finally opened all sealed records to the public. The local newspaper ran a short column, treating the scandal as a curiosity, a footnote to the quaint brutality of an earlier age. The article noted that Catherine Peaton had lived until 1920, dying at 87. It noted that Edmund's fate was unknown. It noted that the descendants of the enslaved community still lived in the region, though most had never been told why 3 of their ancestors vanished in August of 1843. The column concluded with a familiar refrain. It was a different time, with different standards of morality and justice. We can only be grateful we live in a more enlightened era now. But the writer missed the point entirely. Because when you read those documents, not as spectacle, not as old scandal, but as testimony, you begin to feel their weight. Edmund Hargrove was not innocent. He abused his power over 3 enslaved men whose choices were illusions. Yet he was destroyed not for his cruelty, but for violating the performance of a role. Catherine was wronged, but the vengeance she orchestrated eclipsed any personal betrayal. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were casualties of a world built on hierarchies that demanded human sacrifice whenever order trembled. Judge Middleton believed himself custodian of morality. Sheriff Dunor believed he was merely enforcing law. The crowd, 347 citizens, believed they were witnessing justice. But belief is not absolution. When Beaufort erected a historical marker in 2015 near the site where the executions took place, the text was brief. It acknowledged that 3 enslaved men, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, had been hanged there after being convicted of crimes they could not legally refuse to commit. It called the event a tragedy, an injustice, a remnant of laws that prized property over personhood. It left Edmund's name unspoken. It left Catherine's unexamined. It left the story as thin as a pronouncement on stone can be. History is often flattened to fit a plaque. Yet if you walk that patch of ground at dusk, when the shadows lengthen and the air thickens with the low country's humid lament, you may feel something beneath your feet. Not ghosts, though some swear they have heard faint creaking, as of ropes in wind, but the tremor of truth that refuses to be tidy. Because the story of Willowbrook is not simply a moral tale, it is a study in the architecture of cruelty. A reminder that systems do not commit violence on their own. People do, acting through the systems they inherit, justify, and enforce. It is a story without heroes, only human beings bound by the roles their society carved for them. A story of silence and spectacle, of private longings and public retribution. It forces us to ask, when we condemn the past, do we do so to understand it, or to distance ourselves from the shadows it casts into our own time? Edmund, Catherine, the 3 enslaved men, Judge Middleton, Sheriff Dunor, Reverend Cartwright, and the 347 witnesses who filled Beaufort Square are all dust now. Their world has been plowed under by wars, laws, generations. Yet the echoes of their actions remain. Echoes that ask us to consider not how far we have come, but how close we still stand to the places we would rather forget. What do you make of this story? Do you believe all the truth has surfaced? Or do you think more remains buried beneath Beaufort's quiet soil? If this tale has unsettled you, if you want more forgotten histories murmuring beneath America's past, subscribe to Nyctis Chronicles. Share your thoughts below, and join us next time as we unearth another remnant of the night. These events would not remain sealed from history forever. Documents lay beneath the county's lock for decades, and when they were opened, when scholars finally read the white-inked ledger of accusation and punishment, they found not a moral parable, but a complex ruin in which victim and victimizer coexisted, entangled, and destroyed one another. What the town had called justice read differently through the colder, more distant lens of history. Not merely punishment, but the performance of order, the public exacting of control, a community willing to watch its own violence in the name of virtue. Years drifted past like silt settling at the bottom of a river, quietly, invisibly, yet never truly still. The scandal of Willowbrook Plantation, once an eruption that consumed the town's breath, slowly receded into the gauzy half-memory where communities store stories too shameful to forget and too dangerous to repeat. Beaufort carried on. Harvests were planted, children baptized, marriages arranged, fortunes made and lost. But something of that August in 1843 remained under the skin of the county, a faint bruise that never fully faded. Judge Middleton ordered the records sealed soon after the trial. He said it was to preserve public stability, to protect the innocent from gossip, to guard the community from corruption by recollection. But those who knew the judge understood there was another motive, quieter and more human. He did not want history to know what they had done. He did not want the cruelty they sanctioned to be read by eyes untouched by the fever of that moment. The truth was too heavy, too raw, too revealing of the world they had created and maintained. So the files disappeared into locked drawers, left to age in darkness. Generations came and went. People died without passing on the details, carrying them sealed in their chests. Only the faintest shape of the story survived in whispers, fragments spoken in a hush when boys strayed too far into rumor, or when some transgression needed a moral weight to anchor the warning. No one spoke the names Marcus, Samuel, or Daniel. No one wondered what families they had belonged to, what dreams they had harbored in secret, what terror filled their last moments. Their lives, like their graves, were left unmarked. Then, in 1897, more than half a century after that August, a young historian named Thomas Bradford arrived in Beaufort with a notebook, a lantern, and an uncomfortably persistent curiosity. He had come to study antebellum society for his doctoral thesis, expecting ledgers and polite plantation correspondence. Instead, he uncovered the hint of a sealed event. No details, only a vague notation in a county index. Documents restricted until further judicial review. That was enough. Bradford petitioned the court for access. The request rattled old bones. Many descendants of those involved still lived in the county, some clinging to names that had once held authority. The judge hesitated, but the world had changed in 50 years. Reconstruction had come and gone. The South was reshaping itself, uneasily, unwillingly. And perhaps the judge believed that enough time had passed for truth to be handled like a relic rather than a weapon. So access was granted. Bradford spent weeks in that dusty records room, turning pages that smelled of age and humidity. He read Catherine's statement, her letters, the sheriff's notes. He read Judge Middleton's private correspondence, letters in which the judge worried not about justice, but about propriety, reputation, community cohesion. He read the doctor's reports describing flesh torn to ribbons and the testimony of townspeople who had watched in eager silence. Most haunting were the fragments written in the margins of other documents, notes by clerks who had witnessed the punishment. One line, scribbled in shaky handwriting, read, "He made a sound I have not forgotten in 50 years. Another, "Of the 3 slaves, the youngest looked at him with pity. That was the worst of it. Pity. Bradford emerged from that archive changed. He had expected dates and names. He found instead a mirror held up to every society that has ever preserved order through cruelty. He published an article in a small academic journal in 1899, careful and respectful in tone. It made ripples in scholarly circles, then disappeared like a stone thrown into deep water. The country was not ready to look backward with unclouded eyes. Edmund was brought at dawn, stripped to trousers, hands bound, head and wrists locked into the wooden frame. The sun took to noon with a cruelty people read as providence. By the hour, the air thickened. Flies found him. Sweat plastered his skin. His legs trembled from standing. Some in the crowd threw small things, jeering. Others watched in sullen silence. Catherine arrived each day in a carriage with relatives from Charleston, her face practiced into the stillness of one who had prepared herself for an act of civic cleansing. At noon, the lash cracked. Sheriff Denore met the sentence with the unpleasant professionalism of a man who administered law the way others administered mortgages. The leather struck. Edmund first flinched, then groaned. The sound was human and private, and the crowd's appetite ebbed when confronted by the rawness of suffering. The second day found him worse. The wounds from the first lashes had not healed. He bled anew. The vistas of pity widened for a few faces, then closed again under social pressure. By the third day, he had been transformed from a man into an object lesson, skin a map of pain, spirit raw with a new and public knowledge of his own ruin. At 2 o'clock on that final day, the three men were brought to the scaffold. They walked, chained and measured, up the narrow steps. Each spoke in his last moments. Daniel's voice cut across the pious hush when he refused the minister's perfunctory consolation, and instead named the injustice of being punished for a crime born of power imbalances. Samuel's final words were a quiet indictment. We obeyed because we were property. You punish to preserve yourselves. Marcus offered no rhetoric. His glance met Edmund's, and the exchange carried the odd, terrible intimacy of people who had shared the most forbidden hours. The trapdoors opened. The sound that issued across the square when necks snapped was auditory and ceremonial, a quick mercy for them, arranged by the very men who had made law their altar. Bodies swung until the town's ritual requirements were satisfied. Then they were cut down, placed in wagons, carried for burial in unmarked plots reserved for those who had no claim to memory. Everyone present believed they had witnessed justice. Edmund, left in the pillory, watched the spectacle he had authorized through his cowardice and the complacencies of power. Something shattered in him, not only pride but a recognition of consequence. He made a sound that was less a cry than the collapse of a life into its constituent ruins. That sound fed rumor and shame for years to come. After the spectacle, he was carried back to the town jail, bandaged, alive. Judge Middleton visited, delivering the technical mercy of exile rather than execution. Leave, the judge advised. Go anywhere but here. The plantation would be sold at auction to settle debts. The enslaved people would be dispersed by purchase, their families fragmented as property transactions. Catherine returned to Charleston and claimed widowhood in the only way left to her, by erasing the man whose exposure had freed her from the marriage while leaving a trail of ruin behind. In the weeks and months after, Willowbrook's house changed hands. The name Hargrove became for many an asterisk in local speech, a tale told like a cautionary rhyme to boys. Some wondered if Catherine had gone too far, if mercy had been a possibility. Others said the law had finally acted as it should. But for Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, the law was the instrument of their deaths. For Edmund, it was the anatomy of his annihilation. And for Catherine, the instrument by which she reclaimed a narrative she had long been taught was her only currency: innocence. Edmund entered shackled, a pale, creased shadow of the man who had dined under chandeliers and sat in council. His clothes, once crisp, hung limp. His face seemed carved of fatigue. The three enslaved men, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, were brought in separately, their wrists bound, faces composed as any could be who had been taught the cost of showing too much feeling. The law allotted them no voice. They were evidence arrayed in human form. Judge Howard Middleton took the bench with the measured gravity of a man who had spent a life maintaining order. He had known Edmund since boyhood. He had signed contracts and mortgages and marriage licenses that had shaped Willowbrook. Now he read the charges, as if the letters could be made to bear the heft of communal horror. The prosecutor spoke with the blunt efficiency of one whose role was to translate moral panic into legal motion. Then Catherine Hargrove, Catherine, rose and walked to the stand. She wore mourning black, a deliberate visual elegy. Her voice was clear and unadorned as she recited what she had seen. The east wing door ajar, lamplight soft, bed made with household linens missing. 3 men with Edmund, the intimacy she had not been given. The courtroom absorbed each word like a verdict unto itself. Men shifted. Women pressed prescribed palms to hearts. Every descriptive detail functioned as authority. Time, place, the precise arrangement of lamps and sheets. There was no room left for the convenient alibis of rumor. The defense tried, as defense must, to frame the man as ill, as momentarily unmoored from reason. But Catherine's testimony had the weight of method and the composition of a woman who had measured her life in social increments. She had not cried. She had not pleaded. She had catalogued. The jury deliberated 10 minutes, which in a case like this felt like both an eternity and a preordained ritual. Guilty for Edmund, for Marcus, for Samuel, for Daniel. The verdict was a punctuation of a community's need for resolution. The law of South Carolina permitted execution for sodomy. No ambiguity offered mercy. Yet Judge Middleton, balancing statutes and the terror of precedent, chose a cruelty bespoke of his era. He pronounced that Edmund would not be hanged. Instead, he would be destroyed in public and slowly. 3 days confined in the pillory, from dawn to dusk each day. And at noon of each day, 20 lashes administered in the town square. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel would be hanged on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Execution staged so that Edmund would be compelled to witness the direct consequences of his transgressions. There are moments in history when legal language reveals more about a society's fear than about the defendant's conduct. Middleton's sentence read like a communal exorcism. The decision satisfied nobody's conscience fully. In private, some men worried aloud about precedent and fairness, but most welcomed spectacle. They wanted certainty, and they wanted a model of public correction that could be retold at hearths for decades, a warning against vice and a demonstration of moral muscles. Catherine's role did not end at accusation. When she learned the intended order, that the 3 enslaved men might be executed before Edmund's public degradation, she moved again, this time with a cold arithmetic. She would not allow her husband to become a martyr. If the men were dead before his pillory, rumor might soften his image into tragedy. A man who had loved badly, who had sacrificed himself. She petitioned privately to Judge Middleton and asked that the punishments coincide, that the 3 die within sight of the man they had served and deranged his life. Her request was monstrous and precise. The judge, who had already elected cruelty over execution, agreed. The first morning of punishment arrived swollen with heat and attendance. Word had seeped into neighboring counties. Curiosity and righteousness brought people who had no personal stake. The town square was arranged with a new choreography of humiliation. The pillory at center, a whipping post nearby. The gallows frame still under construction, but visible. A silent promise. Chairs were set for the well-born, standing room for the rest. Children were kept away at some houses, brought by others to taste a moral lesson in flesh. On the night of August 11th, she decided she would end the not knowing. She waited until the house's breathing slowed, the servants' lamps snuffed, the distant hush of the quarters, Edmund's measured steps down the hall and down the servants' stair. She gave him 10 minutes to reach the east wing, to settle in and to believe himself invisible. Then she wrapped a dark shawl over her white nightgown and slipped into the garden. The moon was a cold coin in the sky. The path bricks were cool beneath her bare feet. Cicadas hummed. The river whispered its distance. Her heart beat with a sound that might have woken the whole plantation. The side door to the east wing was ajar, light breathing across the gap. She peered through, and what she saw unstitched her world. The room was furnished with a deliberate tenderness, linens missing from the house's inventory, lamps casting an amber hush, a bed made for deliberate dwelling rather than a secret tryst. Edmund lay on that bed, unclothed. Marcus, Samuel, Daniel were with him, bodies entangled, movements intimate and practiced. There was laughter, touches that spoke of time and habit, a tenderness Catherine had never received. Her hand flew to her mouth. She watched as if submerged. The man she had married, parish deacon, civic leader, moved with a freedom she had never known in his company. He kissed Marcus with a softness she had not earned. He laughed at Daniel's whisper. Samuel's hands were steady and sure. The scene lasted no longer than 30 seconds, though time unspooled differently then. Then she turned away, spared the rest of herself the immediate collapse, and walked back to her room as dawn hid in the horizon. Once the truth is seen, it organizes itself into action. Catherine, for that was the name she reclaimed in those minutes, did not scream again. She sat at her writing desk, lit a candle with hands that were suddenly steady, and composed 3 letters. To Edmund's mother, to Sheriff Charles Donor, and to Edmund himself. Each letter spelled out the scene with the clinical precision of one who had been schooled to transform feeling into fact. She slid Edmund's letter beneath his door at dawn, sealed the others, and lay fully dressed in bed to wait. Dawn found Edmund with a sealed accusation in his hands. Color drained from his face as he read words that made the carefully constructed life he had inhabited begin to dissolve. For a moment, he considered flight, saddle a horse, disappear north. But where would he go? He was a planter by birth and training, a man whose identity was bound to land and name. Denial flitted through him, then panic, then a darker reaction. A quick, hot anger at the woman who had exposed him. He knocked on her door. She answered, voice cold and even. "There is nothing to discuss, Edmund," she said. "The letters have been sent. Sheriff Donor will arrive within the hour. Your mother shortly after. I suggest you make peace with God. You will have no peace in this world." When Sheriff Charles Donor arrived at 7:30 with 2 deputies, Catherine met him at the door in her nightclothes, composed as a woman reporting a dispute of property. She led them through the darkened rooms, through the east wing's side door. The lamps still burned low, The bed was unmade. Evidence lay exposed and undeniable. The sheriff, a large man with a gray beard who had watched the county's sins and small mercies for decades, read her account and watched the room. His face did not show surprise so much as a shift toward a professional hardness, a man aware of what law demanded and of how fragile the town's order was when one of its pillars trembled. "These were serious charges," he said, "the most serious a man can face in this state." Already, the machinery of justice, or vengeance, began to click into place. The deputies moved to the study. Edmund did not resist when they entered. He set down his glass and extended his wrists. In the hallway, they passed one another. He glanced at her with something like a wounded plea. She met it without flinch. "I know what I have done," she answered softly, and that was all the answer he needed. The court convened on August 18th, 1843, as if the very architecture of Beaufort had assembled to witness its own disintegration. Pilfered dignity and the town's appetite for spectacle had conspired to fill the room beyond capacity. People stood pressed along the walls, rimmed the windows, crowded the stairways. For days, the town had been a hive of rumors and wagers, of whispers about how a respectable man could fall so completely. Now those whispers found appointment in law. On the morning of August 12th, 1843, a single woman's scream cleaved the stillness of Willowbrook Plantation, a sound that would echo through Beaufort County for generations. What Catherine Hargrove saw that day in her husband's private chambers was a rupture so terrible that the papers refused to print the particulars for decades. Within 3 days, more than 300 citizens would gather in the town square to witness punishments so brutal witnesses carried them, unspoken, to their graves. County records were sealed. When they were finally pried open years later, the truth they yielded was darker than rumor. This was not simply adultery or a private disgrace. It was the deliberate unmaking of a man's life, orchestrated by the woman who understood, better than anyone, how to turn a community's law and fury into a weapon. Bilford, sometimes whispered as Beaufort in the mouths of those who wanted distance, sat in the Low Country, where Spanish moss draped oaks like funeral veils, and the air tasted of marsh and magnolia, both sweetness and rot. Wealth there was a language. White columns, French chandeliers, perfectly joined heart pine floors. The Hargroves lived at the highest syntax of that language. Edmund Hargrove, 35 in 1843, had inherited Willowbrook Plantation 7 years prior. 3,000 acres, a Greek revival house finished in 1838, a life engineered to resemble the very ideal of a South Carolina gentleman. Tall, dark-haired, broad-shouldered from riding, a deacon at church, a voice on the town council, a man whose public virtues were inventory and currency. Catherine Hargrove, born Catherine Peaton, arrived from Charleston in 1837, a match arranged with the same cold precision that aligned fortunes across parish lines. She had the prescribed accomplishments: French, piano, watercolors, a corseted waist, a face sheltered from the sun. Their wedding was a spectacle of 400 at St. Michael's. The couple was, at least in appearance, flawless. And yet 6 years into marriage there were no children, and in parlors that silence was translated into pity and quiet judgment. In the small, merciless economy of reputation, a childless wife is a depreciating asset. What Catherine did not at first understand was why the nursery remained empty. Edmund returned to bed rarely, his presence at the table thin despite frequent attendance at church. The secret lived in the East Wing, behind a door forever locked and spoken of as under renovation. It had names: Marcus, Samuel, Daniel. Marcus, 24, had been in the main house since adolescence, a footman turned valet, light of skin in a place where complexion measured rumor. He moved like a shadow, anticipating needs before they were spoken. Samuel, 26, worked the stables, darker, solid, hands seasoned by leather and beast. Daniel, 21, a carpenter, slight and careful, his fingers trained to the small patience of fine woodwork. Each of them carried the impossible condition of their lives: property, debt, a body not their own in law. Edmund was careful. He never brought them together. Meetings were clandestine, held late in the East Wing's closed rooms, a door with its own garden entrance hidden from polite sight. There was a bed, oil lamps, heavy curtains, a lock. For 3 years he maintained both faces: public deacon, private lover. He smiled across dinner tables. He descended the servants' stairs in the dark and walked the garden paths to that room. For the men, compliance was survival. A denied order meant punishment, sale, family broken. A whispered preference, a late-night summons, became a transaction of small mercies: marginally better food, lighter labor, the impossible illusion of safety. Secrets in a house full of people do not stay sealed. Wives learn the language of footsteps and silences. Catherine noticed small things at first: the East Wing locked, Edmund returning with a removed weight that made him almost buoyant, Marcus's eyes darting away when she entered a room, Samuel lingering in the garden at hours when he should have been in the quarters, Daniel with marks at his throat that suggested fingers or mouths. She folded these anomalies into the ledger of her life for a time, because the alternative, naming the thing by its harsh word, was unthinkable. No gentleman would behave in such a way, she told herself. Nature, God, law, all stood against it. And yet she was not a fool. Training in Charleston had taught her to read what men thought was invisible. 6 years of whispered judgment and cooling courtesy had thinned her patience. The absence of an heir had gnawed at her like a persistent rust. Slowly, a truth seeped into her consciousness. She was living beside a life she did not know, and her dignity had been the currency that purchased his secrecy.